For this third event for the class of 2020, I'm highly delighted to welcome Carrie Summers, founder and Global Operations Director, Fashion Revolution, and crew member of eXXpedition around the world. Why fashion needs a revolution? Carrie Summers was inspired to act after the Rana Plaza factory collapsed in Bangladesh on the 24th of April 2013, and 7 years on, Fashion Revolution has become the world's largest fashion activism campaign. Millions of people have joined Fashion Revolution to demand a fairer, more transparent industry, asking the question, who made my clothes? Carrie has just returned from sailing 2,000 miles from the Galapagos to East Island to investigate microplastic pollution. Carrie has won numerous awards for her work and has been recognised for her significant contribution to fashion business. In 2019, Lyst named her one of the 8 sustainable icons pushing for change in the fashion industry alongside Emma Watson, Pharrell Williams and Stella McCartney. If we all work together, we can and must create a global fashion industry that conserves and restores the environment and values the well-being of everyone and everything on this earth and our oceans over growth and profit. Together we will create a fashion revolution, says Carrie. Welcome, Carrie, over to you.
Thank you. Really delighted to be here to talk to all of you today. And having been a social entrepreneur working within the fashion industry for, gosh, the best part of 3 decades now, I'm really passionate about encouraging the next generation of designers and fashion industry professionals to explore and take responsibility for the social and the environmental impacts of their work. So I just need to work out how to go through my slides because this doesn't seem to be working at the moment. Oh, there we go, okay. So some of you may go on to set up your own fashion businesses once you graduate, and others may work for fashion brands, large and small, but all of us are going to be involved in the fashion supply chain in one way or another, wherever we end up working, because our wardrobes are a part of that supply chain. And we can decide how long our clothes stay in them and where our clothes go after we've finished wearing them. So I'm going to start by asking the question, who made my clothes? Do you know where the clothes you're wearing today have been made? Our clothes may have begun life in the countryside and then travelled across many countries through the hands of hundreds of different workers, working for dozens of different companies, factories and subcontractors before they arrive in our wardrobes. And these journeys remain, in the large part, invisible. The Rana Plaza factory collapse, which I'm sure you all remember in Bangladesh in 2013, was sadly inevitable. There were ever longer supply chains and a resulting shift in responsibility. And what happened reflects a global trend of increased demand which feeds the fast fashion supply chain. Since 1990, at least 2,200 Bangladeshi garment workers have been killed in at least 300 separate safety incidents, yet those calls for improvements have gone unheeded, both by the government and the industry alike. And what really struck me was that after the disaster, it took many brands several weeks to work out what their relationship was with the buildings within that factory complex. And the campaigners had to actually search through the rubble to prove which brands were producing there. And that's when I realised that the workers were invisible, and this lack of transparency and responsibility in the fashion supply chain was costing lives. In the aftermath of the Rana Plaza factory collapse, everywhere I looked, there was calls for a more ethical fashion industry. And I knew that we needed to find ways to channel that concern into a long-standing campaign so that the victims of Rana Plaza and all of those other disasters which have happened in the name of fashion would never be forgotten. And that's when Fashion Revolution was born. So we campaign for a clean, safe, fair, transparent and accountable fashion industry. And we do this through research, education, collaboration, mobilisation and advocating for policy change. That's at a national and an EU and an international level. And 7 years on from the Rana Plaza factory collapse, the struggle for human dignity in the fashion industry is constant and costly. And the environment continues to suffer because of the way in which fashion is made, sourced and consumed. So I just want to rewind a few decades here to the start of my entrepreneurial journey. When I'd just left university, I'd finished my master's in Native American studies, and as part of my thesis I'd studied textile production, and I was really shocked by the inequitable trading patterns which I'd witnessed in Ecuador. I had a fully funded PhD ahead of me, a rare thing these days, even back then, and if I hadn't picked up Anita Roddick's autobiography one sunny afternoon and read it cover to cover in the garden, I think my life would have been very different, but I didn't. I read it and I decided that if one woman could make such a difference within the beauty industry without having any experience in that industry, then there was nothing to stop me from trying to do the same thing, at least in my summer holidays. So I returned to Ecuador to work with two cooperatives who had both experienced arson attacks because of the threat which they posed to the middlemen who controlled the wool industry at the time, because they were organising themselves, groups of producers organising in cooperatives. And although I had no background in design, I produced a series of knitwear patterns using natural dyes like the walnut dye you can see being made here. And they proved so popular that they sold out within 6 weeks. And by the end of the summer, I'd given up my PhD to focus on Pachacuti. The name Pachacuti means world upside down in the Quechua language, and it signified my desire to help to redress some of the inequalities which I'd seen in the fashion industry and demonstrate that it was possible to run a successful fashion and accessories business which benefited the producers and was environmentally sustainable. Back in those days, I mean, fair trade was hardly known. Fair trade was mostly some very undrinkable Nicaraguan coffee. And I think I was probably the first person who put the words fair trade and fashion together. Now, going back to 1992, Ecuador really wasn't a very easy place to work. An armed robber in Ecuador stole all of my first summer's business profits, together with a £5,000 loan I'd taken out from a friend's mother, and 2 death threats followed. And I knew these were serious. I knew that buyers had been killed on the street outside of the hotel just a week before I arrived in Ecuador. And I had to borrow more money at a time when sterling had plummeted because of a Black Wednesday. So it was a really difficult time to start a business. I really feel for anybody who's starting to think about setting up their own business in a difficult economic climate like the present one. And also Margaret Thatcher was in power, and I'm sure not many of you on this call will even have been born during that time, but it was a time when anybody who looked like a traveller was moved on every night. And I wasn't a traveller, but I had a bright pea green Dodge van, and I was often going around to universities to sell the knitwear. So most nights I was moved on by the police in the middle of the night. So it was a really difficult start in terms of setting up my own business, but I'm not easily deterred. And as Pachacuti focused increasingly on Panama hats and headpieces, I started to show my collections at London, Paris and Milan fashion weeks. And my collections were sold in some of the world's foremost luxury stores. And we also produced collaborations for a number of really well-known brands. We also became the first company in the world to be fair trade certified for our entire supply chain in 2009. And we also worked for 3 years as a pilot for the European Union's Geo Fair Trade project. And this really brought about an unprecedented level of traceability to our supply chain at a time when nobody was talking about traceability or transparency, much to my frustration because I knew it was so important. We collected 68 different social, environmental and economic indicators every year to measure our fair trade impact. We also traced our Panama hats back to the GPS coordinates of each weaver's house, which isn't easy when only 45% of them are even accessible by road. and back to the GPS coordinate of each plot of land in the coastal cloud forest where the Carl Ludovica palmata used to make our hats is harvested on community-owned plantations. Once the plant is established, which takes about 3 years, it can actually be cropped once a month for up to 100 years. The plants that we're using here are about 80 years old. So it's an incredible fibre. It grows without the destruction of primary forest. It's grown in organic conditions. It doesn't need any watering. And it wasn't really until I started working at Fashion Revolution I realised just how damaging the mainstream industry is in comparison with the products that I've been producing. So just to give you an idea, one Panama hat uses the equivalent of 13 days drinking water to produce, whereas an equivalent cotton hat needs 825 days drinking water. That would be for a conventional cotton hat. So really, really shocking statistics. One Panama hat uses the equivalent energy of driving a car 2.3 miles, whereas a cotton hat would be the equivalent to driving it just over 15 miles. And only 37% of our producers had even completed primary education. So we had to look for really entirely new and visual ways of assessing our impact on the producers. I mean, a lot of them can't even sign their names when they have to sign in a record book when they turn in their Panama hats every week. They just put in a cross. So really challenging to come up with some of those visual tools, which are now used by a lot of different organisations around the world. So although I no longer work at Pachacuti on a daily basis, and you can find Pachacuti's Instagram account, it's Pachacuti UK, there's lots of information there about the production process and the raw materials. So I know that there's a better way to run a fashion brand, but today most of the global fashion industry continues to lack transparency, and there's widespread exploitation of people within the fashion supply chain. From the child labour in the cotton fields to bonded labour in the garment factories, the global garment industry is one of the biggest contributors to modern slavery, and yet it still remains a hidden crime. Workers continue to be underpaid, and it's really rare that anybody within the fashion industry, not just overseas in countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, India, but also here in the UK in the garment factories in Leicester, which has been in the news a lot this week, and in Manchester. Very few of them receive a living wage. I mean, the typical wage in garment factories in the UK is said to be around £3 an hour. And the typical labour cost when you buy an item of clothing is usually between about 1% and 3%. This is from our fanzine Money, Fashion, Power, which you can see online on Fashion Revolution's website. And we showed the difference between, I was going to say an average t-shirt at €29, that probably isn't an average t-shirt, that's certainly sort of mid-range, but how much more it would cost if the workers received a living wage, and putting up the labour costs from 18 cents to 45 cents, including the markup all the way through the supply chain, would put that €29 t-shirt up by just €1.57. And that's certainly within the 5% limit that most people say they would pay for an item of clothing which was made without exploiting the people who produced it. And then when we look at the environment, I mean, it's been, you know, we've seen how the fashion industry is exploiting those $1 a day hands that make our clothes, but we're also becoming increasingly aware of just how polluting the industry is. It emits around 1.2 billion tonnes of CO2 annually, and that's more than the amount created by international flights and shipping combined. And the process of turning those fossil fuels into textiles for our synthetic clothing, our mostly synthetic clothing, releases significant amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. It's been estimated that an 80% industry-wide emissions cut is needed by 2050 to align with a 2 degrees Celsius warming scenario. And ideally, we want it to be lower than that. But fashion's carbon emissions are actually projected to increase by more than 60% by 2030. Excuse me. And around 60% of our clothes are made from polyester. This quantity's doubled since the year 2000. And fashion's impact on the environment doesn't stop once our clothes have been made, as I saw all too clearly earlier this year. Textiles are the largest source of both primary and secondary microplastics in the ocean. They account for some 35% of all global microplastic pollution. And every time we wash our clothes, up to 700,000 fibres can come off our clothes in a typical laundry cycle. There was actually a paper that came out by the University of Plymouth, I believe it was, just a few weeks ago, saying they believe that there's actually around double the amount of microplastics in the ocean than was previously estimated. So it continues to be increasingly alarming. But then there's no simple solutions when it comes to these materials. A polyester shirt might have double the carbon footprint of a cotton shirt, but synthetic fibres generally have less of an impact on water and land use than cotton. I mean, we all know how many pesticides, herbicides, insecticides conventional cotton uses. This year, Fashion Revolution launched a new hashtag, "What's in my clothes?" And this question isn't just about the materials our clothes are made from, it's also about the chemicals. And the chemicals in our clothing actually took me on my second entrepreneurial journey. So around 16 years ago, when my daughter, Sienna, pictured here, was at primary school, I read some research by the Worldwide Fund for Nature about the chemicals in school uniforms, such as Teflon and formaldehyde, and their potential effects on children's health. All of the coatings which are put on school uniform to make it easy care for parents, stain resistant, something that means you need to wash it less often, although actually all the surveys say that parents continue to wash them just as frequently. So all of these coatings are known to be damaging both to human health, obviously to the children's health, and to the environment. I mean, Teflon has even been found in polar bears, and it's in the bloodstream of everybody listening to this call today. So being a typical entrepreneur, I of course had to do something about it. So together with my husband, I set up Clean Slate, which was the UK's first fair trade organic fashion school uniform company. We talked to so many parents whose children had eczema, and they knew that the chemicals in school uniform exacerbated the condition. The company did a lot to raise awareness, although sadly it had to close after a few years when a large school uniform company went in and poached our suppliers in India, with whom we had an exclusivity contract to make their own uniforms. The text, and there should be a blog hopefully going onto our website this week about school uniforms. So if you're interested in the chemicals in uniforms, then take a look at Fashion Revolution's blog within the next few days. So the textile industry uses about 15,000 different chemicals during the manufacturing process. Apparently the typical fabric that comes into the EU, for a kilo of fabric, the typical weight of chemicals used to produce it would be about 500 grams, so about 50% of the weight of fabric. And we're surrounded by these chemicals every day in our soft furnishings, the pillows we sleep on at night, and in our clothing. And even though our skin is the body's largest organ, there's surprisingly little research. I mean, there is a lot of research, but considering, I think, the gravity of this issue, there's surprisingly little information on this issue. So to help play my part in solving these interlinked problems of microplastic pollution and the chemicals in our clothing, I signed up for eXXpedition around the world. I learned to sail back in the 80s when I sailed on tall ships, and I sailed across the Atlantic and worked on boats in the Caribbean for a year. And I was really excited to go sailing again, but also particularly interested to take part in this really valuable scientific research and to bring back some of these observations to people on land to help them realise the hidden impacts of our clothing. One statistic which really shocked me was that Emily Penn, the co-founder of eXXpedition, had her blood tested for 35 chemicals which are banned by the United Nations, and she found 29 of them in her bloodstream, including flame retardants, pesticides, and other chemicals which are typically found in our clothing. So this voyage will create the first ever global data set of plastic pollution. And it will then work with the industry, with citizens, with policymakers, to help to inform solutions so that we know where to act, because we can't manage what we can't measure. The science we carried out on board every day included manta trawls, which you can see here, to collect the plastics in the surface water. These aren't plastics you could see, these were the invisible microplastics. Niskin bottles, which collected the water from the water column going down about, I think, 15-20 metres. We did sediment sampling when we were closer to shore, chemical sampling, and also air sampling, because there's going to be microfibres and microplastics in the air, even in this most remote area, one of the most remotest areas of the Pacific Ocean. We carried out preliminary research on board using the AFDR machine, but the majority of plastics are going to be analysed back. I was going to say in the lab at the University of Plymouth. I think the machine has now gone into one of the researchers' homes and the plastics are now being analysed. And after sailing some 1,700 miles, we entered the South Pacific Gyre, which is one of the most remote areas in the world, nearest to the remotest inhabited island in the world, Easter Island. And as we got there, the Pacific Ocean, it was anything but Pacific. It was really eerily calm. It was like a mill pond. It was clear blue and it looked pristine. And we spent our days dropping the manta trawl and the Niskin bottle and analysing the results. And every time we pulled them up and filtered through all the water that came out, there was flecks of blue, orange, green, white, black mesh, translucent filaments, as you can see in the bottle here, which are coiled inside the sample bottles. And we're really shocked at what we find. Our trawls within the South Pacific Gyre bring up 5 times more microplastic microfibres than in the total of all of the gyre, all of the trawls that we've carried out outside the Gyre on this voyage. And these plastics obviously aren't coming from Easter Island, they're coming from Latin America, Southeast Asia, all of those other countries, and they swirl around and they accumulate in this area because of the currents. The crew on board the voyage was selected for a multidisciplinary set of skills. So we had artists and sculptors, we had scientists, we had technology and sustainability experts. And I believe that we really need to start to work together to rediscover a multidisciplinary approach. And we need to engage people from all around the world to fight to preserve the beauty and the biodiversity of our oceans. We need to engage in this groundbreaking science that we're collecting on board as a crew, but we also need to start to engage people in an emotional response to plastic pollution, because it feels like we have such sort of ever narrower circles of scientific expertise, and we tend to draw a demarcation line between science and the arts, the subjective and the objective, and we really need to start to reconnect science with the emotions, because we only protect what we love. So through my participation in this truly incredible voyage and sending back photographs and stories from on board, there's 4 blog posts on Fashion Revolution's blog page, which I would really encourage you to read. As well as participating in this research, my aim is to help people to understand that we can't clean up these microplastics in the sea. So we have to look for solutions here on land. And for Fashion Revolution, that starts with our clothing. So what can we do? Building a more sustainable fashion industry and curbing its destructive impact on the oceans will entail governments, brands, retailers and citizens, all of us on this call, all working together to help to end the systemic exploitation of our oceans and of our planet. In terms of policy, governments must act urgently to deal with fashion's escalating environmental problem, and these solutions will in turn help to tackle climate change, and so really they should be a win-win for the governments and the brands. I mean, as a start, the government should require all washing machines to be fitted with filters which will collect the majority of microfibers. That really needs to be done as soon as possible, and we really need a campaign around that. We could also do with a tax on clothes and shoes which contain hazardous substances which are harmful to the environment. This legislation of this kind has just come in Sweden very recently. And although we're seeing some brands starting to take action of their own accord, so many of the laggard brands will only start to make progress when they're required to by law. And I believe that as consumers, we have the right to know that our money isn't spent supporting environmental degradation, but there's no way to hold these brands and retailers to account unless we can see what is truly happening behind the scenes. This is why we believe the first step is greater transparency. Transparency is just the first step along the way. We believe that will lead to accountability, which will eventually lead to a change in the way in which the industry works. Transparency alone doesn't represent that sort of structural systemic change that we want to see within the fashion industry, but what it does do is it helps us to get there because it shows the structures which are in place so we can better understand how to change them. In April, the 5th edition of Fashion Revolution's Fashion Transparency Index was published. This shows us what information brands make publicly available. It doesn't tell you which is a good brand, which is a bad brand. It doesn't necessarily tell you which ones contribute the most to poor working conditions or environmental degradation. What it does tell you is what brands are publishing about their policies, their practices, and their impacts on people and on the environment. It talks about their progress towards their goals as well. So it provides a window on those conditions. And brands are now publishing more information thanks to the Fashion Transparency Index, and that's a really important first step. We look at 5 different areas. We look at policy and commitments, governance, traceability, no-show fix, which is about assessment and remediation of issues within factories, and spotlight issues, which this year included issues like virgin plastics and microplastic pollution. As you can see here in the graph on the far right, 60% of the brands in this year's index aren't publishing a restricted substances list. Only 40% of them are publishing that information. So we really have no way of knowing which chemicals are or aren't allowed into our clothing. And when it comes to the plastics in our clothing and in our packaging, their performance isn't much better, with just 29% of brands publishing measurable progress towards reducing virgin plastics in clothing and in packaging. And considering the need to act urgently on this issue, I'm really surprised to see that just 20% of brands are publishing what they're doing to reduce the shedding of microfibers from our clothing. And this is often in collaboration with a university's research programme. And then also of concern is just the sheer quantity of clothing which is being put on the market. Very few brands disclose this information, and where they do, as you can see here, it's really staggering amounts. As people are forced to stay at home during this pandemic and the retail stores are closed around the world, we know that the demand for clothing has plummeted. And we wonder what will happen to all of these clothes, considering that our research shows that just 27% of brands publish information about the steps they're taking to reduce the amount of pre-consumer waste. So this is the waste created before the clothing hits our shelves, like unsold stock or defective stock and production samples. And only 18% of brands are explaining what they're doing to develop circular solutions to enable textile recycling. So we believe that transparency is the first step in holding these big brands to account for taking responsibility for their policies and their actions. Brands and retailers really must start to understand the true value of materials, which should be mindfully designed and then redesigned and recuperated as part of as a valuable resource. And they must change their business models and create products with longevity and quality. And all of you, if you are intending to become designers, can play a really important role in this. Brands and retailers must disclose what chemicals they're using to make our clothes, and they must use sustainability to drive all aspects of their business. In Mandarin, the word crisis is composed of two Chinese characters. One signifies danger and the other signifies opportunity. There is a pathway through coronavirus towards a different future, but the question remains, will brands and retailers be brave enough to embrace this opportunity and start to create the revolutionary change which the fashion industry so desperately needs to see? And we know that consumers want to see this change as well. At the moment, the resale market in the US is growing 21 times faster than the normal retail market, and the sale of second-hand clothing is expected to outstrip the fast fashion market within the next decade. So things really are starting to change. And some of you watching this webinar may well be thinking of setting up your own businesses, of becoming entrepreneurs within the clothing and textile industry. And you all really have an important role to play, but everybody else can still play their part in bringing about change. We need to learn how to care for our clothes. We can wash them on short cycles on low temperatures to help to reduce microfiber shedding, use liquid detergent and conditioner, and also look at repairing your clothing as well. We've got a really fantastic fanzine which came out a couple of years ago called Loved Clothes Last, which is available online, and really encourage you to take a look at that as well. And lots of videos on our YouTube site. So if you don't know how to patch that, darn that hole in your socks or patch that hole in your elbow, we've got all of the tutorials for you. And then, as brands are clearly disclosing so little progress, we need to use our voice and our power as citizens to bring about change. We've heard from brands that they actually don't take that much notice of petitions because they don't believe it's their customers who sign that kind of thing. But they really do take a lot of notice of messages from their customers. So you can find this email on the front page of our website. You can also contact brands on social media. So please ask them what they're doing in this moment of crisis to be responsible business partners towards the manufacturers and suppliers, the people who they describe as they describe as partners on the website, but at the moment, in the last few months, they haven't been very responsible partners. So I do encourage you, all you need to do is put in the brand's name and it will automatically send an email to some of the top brands and retailers. We help to reshape the fashion industry every time we ask that really important question, who made my clothes, and demand an industry which is free from child labour, modern slavery and all forms of exploitation. And then when we ask the question, what's in my clothes, we're telling brands that we don't want them to use materials which generate massive environmental impacts, leak microfibers into our oceans, or compromise human health and nature's ecosystems. With changes to its systems and its structures, the fashion industry has the potential to lift millions of people out of poverty. It can provide them with decent and dignified livelihoods. And it can conserve and restore our living planet. It can bring people together. It can be a great source of joy, creativity and expression for individuals and for communities. These are some of our Panama hat weavers for Pachacuti here. Individual actions are important, but they're not enough to bring about that systemic change which we need to see within the fashion industry. We must join forces because we're louder and we're more powerful and we stand a better chance of achieving change when we work together. If we all work together, we can and must create a global fashion industry that conserves and restores the natural environment and values the well-being of everyone and everything living on this earth and in our oceans over growth and profit. Together, I really do believe we can create a fashion revolution. Thank you.
Hi everybody, Carrie, thank you for that most incredibly inspiring talk. We'd like to now put it over to our audience to give an opportunity to ask some questions, which they're really literally coming through fast and thick. So I'm just going to now ask some questions. We have, okay. Right, so aside from consumers not buying from fast fashion brands, what one thing would persuade them to change their business model to become more sustainable? And that's from Noelle.
Good question. I mean, I think it's important to say here that we don't think boycotting is beneficial, because a lot of the time, like petitions, we think a lot of the brands think that people who say they've boycotted them actually wouldn't shop from them in the first place. So the most effective thing you can do is to talk to these brands and retailers and say, we love shopping with you. If you like shopping at, wherever it is, if you like going to H&M, Zara, send the messages, because that really does make a difference. We've heard it only takes between 50 to 150 messages to a brand on a certain issue for that to get discussed at board level. That really isn't very many. That's the amount of people on this call writing to one of the main high street retailers on a certain issue. So that really is the one most effective thing that you can do to bring about change within the industry. If you want to do more, I think I would encourage you, there's some really great tools which and platforms which can give you those tools to take you further. So at Fashion Revolution, we have a really great online course, a MOOC, a massive open online course. And I don't know off the top of my head when the next one starts, but I think it's middle of July, and it's called Fashion's Future and the Sustainable Development Goals. It's on Future Learner, and that will give you so much information. it's a free course, and it will give you so much information about the links between fashion fashion and the Sustainable Development Goals, and it will give you the tools for you to start to address that problem. And there's loads of resources on our website as well, so I think that would be the first place to start.
Thank you, Carrie.
I don't think there's not really one simple next step I can say, because I think also everyone has different priorities. So whether you're concerned about animal welfare or human rights, I think it's up to everyone to almost make their own decisions about where they want to ramp up the pressure, whether that's putting pressure on policymakers or on brands.
Okay, brilliant. We have another question from Rebecca. As consumers, what is the best thing we can do to reduce our impact on the environment when purchasing garments?
Check the labels before you buy, and I hope that all of you, I'm assuming most of you are fashion students, I hope most of you do check the labels, and do the research in advance. Look at the fibres, and you can't necessarily say something is good or something is bad. I mean, viscose produced in Europe can be, quite a good and a reasonably sustainable fibre, whereas viscose produced in China can be using ancient endangered woodlands and, be contributing to the destruction of biodiversity. So it's about where these raw materials are from. So it's really important that you do your own research. So check the materials, check the composition, check the brand record on those. If you put in Zara and viscose, do you see that they've, there's been articles about them using, there's been articles accusing them of deforestation for viscose production, or are they sourcing responsible viscose? And ask in the store as well. I mean, I don't buy new clothing that often, but when I do, I always ask the shop assistant, and they might seem a bit surprised, but often they do they'll go and talk to their manager. They often do come back with a reasonably good, a surprisingly good answer. And if they don't know, at least if people ask those questions, they will find out for next time. They'll start to do that research into their own brand. So ask the questions, look at the labels, and if there isn't any information, contact the brand on social media. And if you do get a good response, thank them for having that information, and for their shop assistants, having the knowledge to tell you that they have a sustainable viscose policy, for instance, or that their leather is guaranteed that it's free of deforestation from the Brazilian Amazon. And you know, just do your research, because there aren't any easy solutions. You know, a lot of people are avoiding leather, but you know, look at the alternatives as well in terms of PVC from plastic and fossil fuels. So there's, you know, a lot of the time there aren't really any easy choices. So I think it's up to everyone to, we've got a mantra: be curious, find out, and do something about it. So do your research.
Thank you, Carrie. We have another question. Do you think this recent period of lockdown, and in some cases enforced withdrawal from fashion consumption, has made any difference to people's views on consumption? Is there any work that you know of that's measuring this? Thanks, that's from Jackie.
Oh, interesting. I don't know of any measurements yet. I mean, it's certainly a question we're being asked a lot in the press. I've had so many press requests on this, and I keep saying, well, we don't know, and we don't know what the long-term impact is going to be. I mean, you know, sadly, when we look back historically at, you know, big epidemics, at wars, at, you know, times in different countries of unrest, which have contributed to shops closing, people not being able to buy clothing, usually things have got back to normal within about 2 months, and clothing purchasing is usually one of the first areas to bounce back, as people want new clothes. They want bright, colourful clothes to kind of symbolise that, you know, that period has been put behind them. So usually I'm an optimist. At the moment, I'm not being that optimistic. I want to be optimistic. I want to be hopeful about this. I don't know of any metrics on it so far. I'm sure there will be plenty of them coming out in the near future as we, you know, as the stores have only reopened, you know, quite recently. It would be really interesting to see what their, you know, what the retail figures are when brands and retailers disclose the next quarterly sales. I think that will be when we'll really see how, you know, has there been any long-term impact on shopping habits.
Thank you. The questions are just like incredible, but I'm just going to ask one more because we're running out of time. From Nyan, hi, I have a couple of questions if that's okay. Firstly, is there anything we could do as students to minimise the popularity of sweatshops, give the unfortunate garment makers a better, safer life? And secondly, can you briefly explain your quote, "There is no beauty without truth. There is no truth without transparency"?
Yes. Gosh, I mean, what can you do? And I think, interestingly, you know, obviously locally in Manchester, you have a lot of garment manufacturing. You have a lot of factories there. And I know before I left to join eXXpedition in January, it was raised in Parliament that there was a fear that up to 10,000 people in Manchester could be trapped in conditions of modern slavery in the garment industry there, which is just so, you know, it's so shocking. Or maybe that was in the UK generally, but I mean, that's still an incredibly high statistic for the garment industry. So yeah, I mean, what can you do? I think put pressure on your local MPs, particularly in Manchester. You know, you are their constituents and they need to listen to you. So if you write to your local MP, they have a duty to respond to you. So I would encourage you, there is a tool on our website, on our resources page, and certainly in our Get Involved pack for citizens, it will tell you how to write. There's like a downloadable postcard to write to your policy maker. So I would encourage you to put pressure on your policy makers to look at the garment industries. You know, look at what's just happened in Leicester, where we've been told that, you know, the workers were told they had to come in to work, that the garment factories didn't close during the lockdown. And even when people were sick, they were told that they had to come into work, with the factory owners knowing that they would be infecting people because they were working in close proximity. I mean, it's so shocking. This happened in Leicester. It's very likely to have happened in Manchester. So use your power as citizens and write to your MPs. There's no beauty without truth, and there's no truth without transparency. The no beauty without truth, gosh, it's going to have escaped me at the moment. It's a really well-known quote from, I might even need to look this up. There's a really well-known quote about beauty and truth. Let me just look up and see if I can find it. John Keats. So John Keats wrote, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty," and that's a well-known quote, and I should have remembered who it was. And I said, well, yes, beauty is truth, but you can't have truth without transparency. But how do you know the truth unless brands are disclosing this information? So we all want beautiful clothing. We all want to know that brands are being honest with us, but we can't have honesty without transparency. I mean, transparency, if they're not being transparent, it doesn't mean that they're not doing really good things, but unless they're telling us what they're doing, how do we know? We don't know what they're doing behind the scenes. So that's where the beauty is truth. Truth is, yeah, there's no beauty without truth, and there's no truth without transparency comes from. I think if you want to look at the whole article, it was in the introduction to the Fashion Transparency Index 2019, which will expand on that.
Thanks, Carrie. Everybody, thank you for the questions. If we can, we'd like to pass them on to you because we don't have time today to answer everybody, but we'd just like to say amazing thanks to you. We're going to close the event, but you have been so inspiring. I wish this was live and we could all stand up and give you a standing ovation and clap. And now we value our industry partners so much for supporting us. For our students, it's onwards and upwards for our class 2020 because you guys, you have the power to drive change. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.